In 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 through 17, the Apostle Peter begins to instruct his readers on how God's people are to live in a right relationship with unbelievers in a faithless and perverse society. As our own society becomes more and more pig-headed, Peter's instructions ring just as true and clear for us today as we struggle to understand who we are in Christ and attempt to live rightly in an increasingly un-Christian world. To live rightly in an alien place that has different values and practices than those appropriate for the people of God's holy nation, the apostle gives his readers two major thoughts to consider. First, our allegiance to God in Christ does not exempt us from submitting to pagan authority. And second, we must keep our identity as God's holy people and be prepared, if necessary, to suffer unjustly and without retaliation for holding to our convictions as followers of Jesus Christ. Peter starts by making the transition to the heart of his letter in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 through 12, with his main concern that Christians live godly in a godless society. Regardless of where we find ourselves, we are to live as faithful witnesses to the truth of Christ's gospel in an honorable way. Remember, Peter views our relationship to society as that of visiting strangers and resident aliens who appreciate, respect, and value their host land, but who do not adapt or adopt every expectation of that society. And according to Peter, our goal should be to live in such a way as to quiet the negative stereotypes associated with Christianity. For example, that Christians are judgmental, exclusive, intolerant, and outdated. This is to be accomplished by being royal people who do not indulge in self-destructive behavior and whose lifestyle can be recognized as good even by pagan neighbors. In this form of lifestyle evangelism, Peter expects that instead of speaking evil against us, non-believers will hopefully be among those who ultimately glorify God. Peter writes, "Dear friends, I urge you as resident aliens and visiting foreigners to abstain from carnal desires that war against the soul, and maintain a good way of life among the Gentiles, in order that, although they speak against you as evildoers, because they recognize your way of life from your good works, they will glorify God on the day of his visitation. The good way of life that Peter instructs is the opposite of the previous mentioned useless way of life in which his readers had once lived. His description of them as resident aliens and visiting strangers reminds his readers that they are citizens of God's holy nation and not primary citizens of their society in which they live, to whatever extent the two may conflict. As resident aliens and foreigners, Peter's readers are to abstain from carnal desires. Earlier, Peter warned in chapter 1, verse 17, that God is observing you and I, and that our lifestyle is to be lived in reverent fear of God, being observed by unbelievers as well. Our same Christian lifestyle should, to whatever extent possible, be characterized in a way that even pagans recognize as good. According to the Council of Jerusalem's earlier letter to the Gentiles, which Peter helped to write before writing this letter, the carnal desires Peter has in view may include, but are not limited to, eating food sacrificed to idols, eating food with blood still in it, and eating meat from strangled animals, as well as sexual sin. You can see that at Acts chapter 15, verse 29. Such unrestrained indulgences are to be avoided. In addition to the usual list, we can also add the carnal desire to be accepted by society, which motivates ungodly behavior that is socially acceptable. Self-control that enables one to abstain from carnal pleasures was highly valued by the Greeks among whom Peter's readers were living. The challenge Peter thus presents is to live by the good values of one's society that are consistent with our own Christian values, and reject those that are not, thereby maintaining our distinctive identity in Christ. Peter wants his readers to live by God's standards, and when they conflict with those of society, to be willing to endure graciously the grief and alienation that will inevitably result. According to Peter, the significant outcome of proper Christian behavior with respect to society will be that Gentiles glorify God on the day of his visitation, which is a reference to the return of Jesus Christ and his final judgment. Peter hopes that by this time, believers who have observed the good works of Christians will themselves have come to the faith in Christ. As an example of how to live honorably in a non-Christian society, Peter goes on in verses 13 through 17 to specify how we are to relate to the political authorities of the world. In his view, Christians must be subject even to pagan leadership, even to ungodly leadership, even to as ungodly as the Roman emperors, who at the time Peter wrote was probably either Claudius or Nero. Not only must Christians obey secular authorities, they must also do good for those same authorities in order to silence the slander against the church, as is God's will. Peter goes on to write, "Be subject to every human institution because of the Lord, whether to the emperor because he is the supreme authority, or to the governors because they are sent by him to punish those who do evil and commend those who do good. For it is the will of God that by doing good you silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but not as using freedom for a cloak of evil, living rather as slaves of God. Respect all people, love fellow believers, fear God, and honor the emperor." Submitting to the control of human authority is defined by the Apostle Peter as part of God's will, that his people do good in order to silence the stupidity of unbelievers. His insistence is not to be taken as an invitation to slavery. On the contrary, Peter declares his readers to be free people. They are free to choose to be slaves of God, to not escape from service, but instead to change masters. Being free from sin, we are free to live in such a way that honors God before the eyes of an unbelieving society, and not as we once did. For as John Calvin once wrote, "The Christian life is both a free service and a serving freedom." Peter's urging here is founded on the divine claim that it is God's will, not simply his, that Christians do good when surrounded by an unbelieving culture, because by such behavior they will be publicly recognized by the authorities for their good works, works that benefit society. Peter's instructions are firmly positive toward the Roman emperor and his regional governors. Peter seems to think that if Christians live as good citizens, the ruling authorities will look with favor upon them, or at least not publicly trouble them. At the time when Peter wrote, although Christians were socially and perhaps professionally alienated in some ways, they had not yet begun to suffer the state-sponsored persecution as a matter of social policy. Peter is thus still hopeful that the church can maintain good relations with the state. Peter sums up his opening instructions by stating that all people are to receive due respect. Fellow believers are to be loved, God is to be feared, and the emperor is to be honored. This statement is a reference to all the contexts in which you and I live. An unbelieving society, the Christian community, God's presence, and worldly politics. Peter's thrust is clear. Christians must live, and live well, by giving each type of relationship its due honor. According to Peter, living as a Christian first requires the resolve to abstain from inner desires that are stipulated and validated by an ungodly society. And second, the resolve to do good, which silences the ignorance of fools. In addition to bodily passions, the unspecified desires in Peter's mind may have included the desire to be accepted by society more than to please God. To unnecessarily rebel against social customs, and to participate in practices that are abhorrent in God's sight. The primary purpose for self-control is to evangelize and attest to the truth of the Christian gospel. For our winsome way of life, even in the midst of difficult circumstances, is to be a witness that brings unbelievers into the Christian community, so that they too may glorify God on the coming day of judgment. These general instructions here in chapter 2, verses 11 through 17 about Christian relationships prepare Peter's readers for his next instructions to servants, wives, and husbands. Join us next time as we look at 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 18 through chapter 3, verse 7. God bless.